Well, good morning again. Jody and David Green, come on down. Where are you at? Jody and David, come on down. Y'all give them up. Round of applause. We're gonna do a little sommelier type coffee testing type thing this morning. So for those of you who don't know what a sommelier is, it's somebody who is an expert in all things wine, and so they can tell you how it smells and where it's from and what it tastes like and all the notes. And so first we have Jody right here who drinks probably 13 cups of coffee a day. Absolutely loves coffee. Not exaggerating. This is a new cup, and if you look at it, you can't, but if you could see it, it's like brown. It's stained. Yeah. It's an amazing thing. And then you have David to his right who absolutely hates coffee, right? Does not like coffee at all. And so here's what we're going to do this morning. David, Jody's going to take a sip of his coffee, and I need you to tell me what he's experiencing. Okay? So go ahead and take a sip of that. Make sure nice, big, hot gulp. Yes, there we go. David, what is Jody experiencing?
I have no idea, but what I think is bitter and nasty.
Bitter and nasty. Jody, how would you explain what you are experiencing?
It's just a warm cup of goodness.
Warm cup of goodness. Any notes of anything in there? You know, people do that with like chocolate and
It's
hazelnut.
There's a caramel.
Caramel, okay.
Not added, but there's a caramel note in it.
Okay. Not a big old cup of nasty, but just a big old cup of goodness.
Caffeine.
Caffeine. Can you taste the caffeine? Is it like vibrant through you?
I'm so numb to it.
Y'all give it up for David and Jody. So here's the deal. Sometimes in life, one person experiences something else, and somebody else has maybe never experienced that thing or doesn't really understand what's going on. And so it's really hard for them to know what the other person is experiencing. It's really hard for them to put themselves in the shoes of that other person. And this morning's text is one of those moments where we might have a tendency to read this text. And we might come across it and go, well, I don't know that I've ever been there. I don't know that I've ever experienced this thing, so I don't really know how to express it. Maybe this text isn't for me specifically. He says, do not be anxious. Well, I've never really been anxious about stuff, or I've never really had a food scarcity problem in my life. And so really this text in and of itself really isn't for me. And I would really strongly push back on that. I would strongly push back to say that maybe you've never experienced the things that Jesus is talking about in this text to the degree that you're thinking about. But I promise as we walk through this text, each and every one of us has experienced the anxiety or worry that Jesus is discussing. We've also experienced some of the basic worries around the things that we would quote unquote say we need. I was speaking about our sermon this past week with a friend up in Nashville, and I was, kind of wrestling with how do I express this understanding and this need for the lack or to get rid of worry around an idea that most of us would probably never experience. And here's what I mean. Most of us have never experienced the question of, well, when are we going to eat our next meal, right? Will there be a next meal? Most of us already have plans for lunch. It isn't a question of when or how, it's a question of what. Now listen, some of you in this room maybe have experienced it in the past, and if you're experiencing something like that today, please come find someone, because no one should go hungry in this world. And so if you are struggling to know when your next meal is coming, please find one of our staff or elders or someone on our care team, and we would love to walk with you through this. But as I was talking with him about this, he sent me a sermon from his pastor, and I really love the way that this pastor kind of outlined some things, so I'm going to steal one part of his sermon. And basically the way he says is there are three things that this passage teaches us. It teaches us a principle, a picture, and a promise. It gives us a principle, a picture, and a promise. So let's dive straight into this text. Luke chapter 12, verse 22. And he said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing." Our text this morning uses the word anxiety or worry, depending on your translation, 3 different times. The translators in your scriptures may have even given it a title of saying, do not be anxious. And like I said earlier, we may come across that title in our quiet time, or we may come across that in another moment, or even here this morning, listen to the sermon, go, I don't really struggle with anxiety, so this isn't really for me. Y'all just drink your cup of coffee and I'll sit here and chill. But I would argue that what everyone has experienced in life comes back to this idea and what Jesus is going to refer to when he says, do not be anxious. We have all experienced the anxiety that Jesus is talking about. And even more so, Jesus knows this because he talks about this 2 separate times. Now listen, when Jesus tells us something as a command, he says, do not. It's important. When Jesus says something twice, it's very important. This excerpt from Luke chapter 12, this moment, is a separate moment from a moment that Jesus teaches this same thing in Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6 is the famous Sermon on the Mount. It's actually Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus looks at this great crowd of people, and he tells them to not be anxious. And then later, in this moment right here, in Luke 12, he repeats this same teaching, not to a great crowd of people, but to his disciples. So when Jesus gives us a command, we need to know that, number one, it's important. But when he gives it to us twice, we really need to lean in. And it doesn't mean that there is anyone in this room who can get out of this, who, I don't really struggle with anxiety. What he is discussing here is something different. He isn't discussing the type of anxiety that comes from a childhood trauma or some other situation. He's speaking in a much more general sense. Jesus is speaking about being worried about the everyday things in life. He's talking about us and our experience day in and day out, and us experiencing worry or anxiety about the normal things. He actually uses 2 different words in this passage in the original language. One of the words he uses in verse 29 when it says worry is a word that's not used anywhere else in the New Testament. And it brings about this idea of something like the worries put us in this space of we're in the middle of nowhere. We're just floating around because we're so wrapped up in the worry of the day that we don't have our feet grounded anymore. That we're just up in space. We can't stay focused. There's no clarity. Don't raise your hands, but have you ever been there before? You know what I mean? Where you can't stay focused because whatever is on the horizon, whatever is bothering you is stealing your attention. Jesus gives us specific examples, of food and clothing. This is yet another moment for us, like that cup of coffee, where we could tentatively kind of check out. You go, well, I've never experienced food scarcity. I've never had a lack of clothing. So this text doesn't really apply to me because I've never been anxious about those things. Well, have you ever been anxious about anything in the basic day in day out life? Have you ever been anxious about the way people think about you? Have you ever been anxious about not having enough or keeping up with the Joneses? That your clothes aren't enough? That maybe your kids' clothes aren't enough. They don't have enough. That you don't have the right things. And so, or maybe this happened to my wife and I several years ago. We were in a place of struggle financially. We were trying to get ahead on some different things. And so we kind of made a pact one another, hey, we're not going to go out to eat. And it seems like Satan heard that out loud, because at that same moment, every couple we knew picked up the phone and called us and said, hey, you want to go out to eat this week? And so we were in the middle of this decision. It wasn't that, we were trying to be financially frugal. It is that we were broke. So it wasn't like, we're trying not to. No, we can't, right? So we could have like fumbled through that and lied and be like, or we could have just swallowed the pill and said, hey, listen, it's just not a great time right now. Now, I'd like to tell you that every conversation I had with somebody at that point, I said, hey, it's not a great time right now. I don't remember the honest answer. My wife probably would, because she remembers everything. So But I think we've all experienced basic anxiety issues in our life. Worry about, do we have this? Do we have that? Are we going to be able to supply these things in our life? And the reality is that most of us have been blessed beyond all measure in this room. We don't wonder if we're going to have a next meal. We wonder when or what it's going to be. If you fall into a category of thinking about the next meal and the next meal and this event and that event, you've probably experienced worry about it. Oh, I've got people coming over, make sure we got all the things in perfect place, right? Some of you probably hosted an Easter meal, and you were frantically going around stores, maybe looking for some eggs at the last moment, or cream cheese for that cake, or whatever it was. And in that moment, you were so worried about putting on this event that you may have gotten sidetracked on whatever else was going on in the day. We are a blessed culture. We don't necessarily think about the basics of, are we going to have a next meal, or will we have enough clothing? For us, it's, will it be enough? In the 1950s, the average house being built was just under 1,000 square feet. Fast forward to 2022, the average house being built was 2,300 square feet. The average size family has not increased dramatically for us to need a bigger house. But we all feel like what? We need a bigger house. So those of you who are living in a 2,000 square foot house, if I said, hey, let's go downsize into 1,000, well, I need my shop. I need that spare bedroom in case someone comes and stays with us. I need my own office. I need that garage. I really need a bathtub that's, bigger than this baptismal. I need these things. That's how we feel, right? But the truth of the matter is, there's some much more basic needs, and if we're honest with ourselves, we probably experience a little bit of anxiety or worry about these things that we would call needs, that are really just wants. Now, I don't want you to read into this text to think that the person who's struggling with anxiety about what they're going to eat versus the person who's struggling with anxiety about where they're going to eat, one is better than the other. I think sometimes we get to that in our culture. The reality is that both are experiencing anxiety. Period. Now, sure, could we argue that the person who doesn't know if they're going to have a meal maybe has a little more, stock in the game versus the person who's wrestling with Zaxby's or Chick-fil-A, which it's hands down Chick-fil-A, all right? Popeye's chicken. All right, anyway. Listen. Both of us in those situations are struggling with trust and control. What Jesus is pointing us to is this principle that he says in verse 23. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. And that's the principle, that life is more, and then fill into the blank. Life is more, and then fill in the blank. Whatever it is for you, whatever you're struggling with, the relationships, the keeping up with the Joneses, the basic food or the basic clothing or the type of clothing or which school or what vacation or whatever it is, what Jesus is teaching in this text is that life is more than that thing. He's speaking to the disciples, as I've mentioned, and he's telling them this idea and this principle in the context of what we spoke about last week in the parable of the rich fool. So it's this idea where the rich person is making a lot of money, we'll just say, right? He's actually creating a lot of crops, and his barn isn't big enough, so instead of trying to figure out a way to maybe give some away or just be content with what he has, what does he do? He tears down his barns, make bigger barns so that he can keep all of his crops, and then in that moment, he dies. So he doesn't get to enjoy any of the crops. He doesn't get to enjoy any of the wealth that he consumed in those moments. And Jesus points back at us and says, this is idolatry. And what Jesus is doing to the disciples in this moment is he's making an intellectual connection. He's making us remember this story of the rich fool, and he's calling us to recognize the idols in our life. And then he's calling us to look at them and the everyday life stuff. We all have idols. These are things that draw our attention away from God. Things like money, stuff, cars, houses, relationships, and maybe even food. These things give us a sense of security and control. And he's calling us to recognize those things and then think about our everyday life experiences and then ask the question of which one matters more, the stuff or Jesus in the everyday things of life. The anxiety that Jesus is speaking about is better understood in this connection about we need to stop worrying about the everyday stuff of life. Because that worry comes down to one thing: control. Control. I'm reading a book, I should say listening to a book. Y'all ever have that debate, like, what's the difference? Is there, if I'm listening am I listening to it on Audible, whatever, am I actually reading it? The answer is no, you're listening to it. So just in case you were having that debate. I'm listening to a book. It's called The Psychology of Money. And this guy is a bona fide atheist, has no creationism at all, has no deity that he worships, and yet so much of what he's teaching draws back to what Jesus teaches over and over and over again, that we are idol factories and that we enjoy control. And he has this quote. He says, people want to control their lives. The ability to do what they want, when they want, with who they want, for as long as they want, is priceless. See, we're not necessarily worshiping money or stuff or whatever. What we're worshiping when we struggle to let these things go is control. And that's what he says in his book, Psychology of Money. And I think in many ways, this is what Jesus is teaching us in this text, is that we need to yield control because life is more than whatever you put in that blank spot. Next, verse 24, Jesus gives us this picture. The first thing he gives us is a principle. The second thing he gives us is a picture in verse 24. It says, consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. And how much more value are you than the birds? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? If then you are not able to do a small thing as that, adding an hour to your life, why are you anxious about the rest? Then he gives another picture. Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today, and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not seek what you are to eat and what you are to drink, nor be worried. What Jesus is calling us to do is to look at the life on this earth and to see how it doesn't worry about what's coming next. If you turn on National Geographic or Discovery Channel or watch whatever shows about life, what you don't see from the animals in creation is worrying about their next thing. You just see them living life. Yes, he's built some systems in place for some of these animals to, gather food and then hibernate or rest during different months, but that's just the basics of their life. You can almost look at this like from the movie The Lion King. The circle of life, you know what I'm saying? Sing the tune. Here we go. I'm just kidding. But if you listen to that song and watch that movie, what you see over and over again is just this idea of just things grow, things die. Things grow, things die. Things grow, things die. And yet in all of it, what we know is that God is holding all of it together. And Jesus compares these basic things, just normal life, the rhythms of how it goes. Like pollen season is coming and the trees aren't worried about it, right? The bees aren't worried about it. It's just happening in life. And he compares this kind of basic idea in nature to something that is highly unreachable for you and for me. And then he calls it a small thing. So some of your translations may say he added an hour to his span of life, while others may say he added a cubit to his height. How many of you have the cubit to his height in their Bible? A couple? So it's really just a semantical thing right there in the original language. Really what Jesus is getting at is this idea. A cubit, by the way, is 18 inches. So most of us, if we needed to add an inch to our height, we'll just put on little high heels or something, right? Hopefully not the men, but, stack your napkins and your socks and get a little higher. Make sure you stand up nice and straight. That's how you add an inch. How are you going to add 18 inches? You can't. I think it was back in the old days that the Chinese had this method of somehow like stretching the body. I think it was something like in the 15th or 16th century. They had this machine, kind of like Princess Bride, tormenting machine, if you know what I'm talking about. Like they latch you in and then it stretches you. Yeah, that might add you like 3/4 of an inch. Painful 3/4 of an inch there. It's not going to add you 18 inches, right? How can you add an hour to your life? Well, you eat right and you diet. Well, did you add any? I know a lot of really good people who have dieted and exercised, and they're probably going to die at the same point they were going to die before. Because God knew when they were going to die anyway, right? They didn't add anything. This is just kind of their life. This is how they are. And he takes this thing that's really out of our control, because you can't add time to your life. You have no idea when you're going to die. I mean, you could eat right, live healthy, all the things, walk out of this door, get in your car, take a left, take a right, car accident, it's over. And that broccoli did a lot of good for you. Right? I'm not telling you not to eat broccoli. It's good for you. It'll make your life better while you're living. But it didn't necessarily extend your life, did it? Like you can't look back and go, ooh, it was the broccoli. That's how I made it to 55 or to 92. Whatever, right? You can't do that. And that's what Jesus is looking at. So he says this to the disciples, and I feel like they kind of laughed back, like, ha, I get it. It's a small thing for you. But what he's saying is this unreachable thing is such a small thing for him. Why can't we be more like the natural creation and just rely on him for the everyday stuff? Well, the answer is this. It's because you like to have control. And maybe it should be put like this. You like to think you have control. Because we don't have control, do we? It's just like that story of going out and taking a left or a right. You didn't have control over that situation. That's the picture he gives us. That the everyday world doesn't necessarily worry or get anxious about the everyday things because God's holding it all together. Why can't we do that same thing? And in the final verses, he shows us this promise. Verse 30 through 34. It says, "For all of the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek his kingdom. Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Fear not, little flock. For it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions, give to the needy, provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Here's the promise. Seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. We've got a principle. Jesus is saying life is more than whatever you want to fill it with. Fill that blank. Life is more. Look at the earth around you in this picture and how I hold all things together. How I've already mapped out the end times in Revelation and Daniel and other places. I've already foretold all of these things. Just look back to Jesus and the prophecy that surrounds him. Hundreds of prophecies were fulfilled in one man. Hundreds. Some might even go to thousands. And yet we struggle for the day in, day out things. And we struggle to give up control. But Jesus looks back at his disciples and he looks back at you and me today. And he says, all of the nations are battling for all of these things. If you want wholeness, if you want peace, if you want the grace that I have for you, then seek my kingdom. And then he modeled it. He comes on this earth, gives this teaching over and over again, lives a perfect life, a life free of anxiety in the sense of going against God. I'm sure that there were moments where he was like, man, I'm really ready for that next bread. I'm really ready for some new clothes, because he walked as a human on this earth, right? So don't think that Jesus was free of desires or free of temptations. You know what Jesus was free of? Sin. So he knows what you're struggling with. He knows what your flesh wants you to do. But he goes through this process of living as the sacrificial lamb. And then he goes to the cross in your place. And he says, it is finished. And he said it for you, right where you sit today. Right in the middle of the sin in your life, wherever you found yourself a year ago, a year from now. Jesus died to give you victory. And so the question is, will you yield control of your life and surrender to him? Let's pray. Lord, as we heard from your word this morning, will you lead us to a place of giving up control, of recognizing that you do hold this world together, that the things that we feel like we can control, God, you're calling us to give them over to you. That doesn't mean that we don't care. That doesn't mean that we just walk through life apathetically or aimlessly. But God, that we recognize that you've given us freedom, that we can trust in you, and that we don't have to worry about the everyday stuff of life. And that our standard isn't the world's standard, but our standard is you. That we find wholeness and contentment in you. God, would you call us to repent for the things that we hold so dearly, for the little idols in our life that pop up, the little whispers from the enemy. Would you allow us to lay them down at the foot of the cross and to receive that idea that life is more than that thing, and that life is truly better when we seek first your kingdom. God, help us to receive that. Help us to walk in that. It's in your son's name I pray. Amen. Let's stand and sing.